Welcome to GCSE Masterclass. Now this is a guide to war photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, which is covered in the AQA Power and Conflict anthology. Now here at the front there is a very disturbing image, and I'm sorry if it disturbs some people. This is napalm victims in the Vietnam War, and this photo is referenced in the poem, and it shows you very much the danger that war photographers face, and that they're doing it to try and stop the suffering of people like the children in this photo. Okay, so what's this poem about and what's the context? Well, it's a modern setting, and this poem is really exploring how we as a society in England and the Western world are desensitised to violent war images. And what we mean by that is that we see so many photos and videos of war on the television that we no longer feel its impact in the way that really we should naturally. The poem explores how this fictional photographer is feeling and their motivations. And we see that this photographer is feeling increasingly isolated from the two worlds he inhabits. This means that really what he's feeling is he doesn't belong in the war zones that he visits, because he isn't really part of those societies. He can return home. But he feels alienated from England and the people in England because they don't feel as he does. He doesn't feel as strongly about the dangers of war and how we should stop it. So he feels he doesn't fit anywhere. And there's a real reference in the poem to the photograph that I showed you at the beginning, this deeply disturbing photo of a 9-year-old napalm victim, and it's Panti Kim Phuc was the young girl running with no clothes. The photo was taken by Nick Ut, and what had happened in this photo, there'd been a napalm bomb, this really unpleasant chemical that burns the skin and kills. And this young girl's clothes had been burnt by this chemical, so she'd had to strip off and run. And we see the danger of a war zone and the risks that war photographers take. So we've got this fictional war photographer as the main character, and it was inspired by a friend of Carol Ann Duffy's. Okay, so let's start off. We'll read the first stanza. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. Now let's look at some key quotes here. We've got in the second line, spools of suffering. Now this is referring to the sort of the reel of a photo reel. And we see that it's a circular rotating shape. Now this feels like it's a metaphor for a constant cycle of violence that repeats and repeats. But obviously it's also literal imagery. On his reel or his spool there are pictures of lots of people suffering. So both literal and metaphorical. Let's go now to the third line. We hear the only light is red. Now again there are two meanings here. The literal, because for a photo to develop you need red light, you can't have white light or you destroy it. So we've got that literal meaning. But it also in our head, when we think of red, we've got the imagery of blood. And that gives a suggestion that there's a lot of bloodshed and suffering in these war photos that he's developing. Okay, let's have a look now. Now we hear that this photographer views himself as if he were in a church. He a priest and he's intoning a mass. So he's seeing himself as a sort of priest-like figure. We've got this semantic field of religion, and it's representing the view that he's doing God's work or a sacred act through his dangerous work. And I think what the fictional photographer is feeling is that, and perhaps Carol Ann Duffy is supporting this feeling, is that the work of a war photographer is sacred, because they're trying, through the risks they take and the photos they're taking, to end wars, to make us learn about them and to put an end to the suffering. Okay, let's look at the last line. We've got a kind of listing of war zones: Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all places with big wars that have taken place. Now rather than usual listing, it's broken by full stops, which can be called caesura, this sort of sharp breaking. And we imagine the fictional photographer pausing to remember each place and the suffering there. So he sort of stops and he's imagining each place and what happened. And I think by having all these places listed, we're emphasising the enormity of the issue. Carol Ann Duffy is saying to us, it's everywhere, it's all over the world. War and suffering are everywhere. Last line of this stanza, all flesh is grass. It's a biblical reference from the Old Testament, from Isaiah, and it means all life will end. We'll all end up in the ground. The photographer is facing death every day, and this quote is used by Duffy to show how vulnerable we all are, that the photographer faces death every day and realises this vulnerability, that we are all destined to die, for some much sooner than they should. Okay, let's do the next one. Second stanza. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England. Home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So here we've got a picture of the photographer in his house, and he's developing the photos, and his hands begin to shake, and we go into his thoughts a little. Let's have a look at the first line, solution slop. Now, solutions is rather an ambiguous noun. It could be a reference to the photographic solution moving, or to the solutions for war, for stopping war. And so there seems to be this ambiguous meaning, the idea that the solution is moving in the tray, but that nobody can really grasp and understand how to fix war, how to solve it. The repeat of the S sound here is called sibilance, and it feels rather fluid, as if the solutions to war are like a liquid which we can't fully hold on to, we can't grasp. Let's look at what his hands are doing now. So in the second and third lines, his hands did not tremble then, though they seem to now. We've got a contrast, haven't we? How when he was in the war zone, his hands weren't shaking in fear, and this is showing his professionalism. But we also see that once he's looking at the photos back at home, his hands are shaking. So we see the emotional toll it's taking on him, that he's suffering from his job. Let's have a look now in the third line. We've got rural England. It's a two-word sentence broken with full stops and caesura. It feels rather separate from the rest of the poem and the places of war. I think this seems to be representing physically in the poem how in England we are very separate from war, and we're isolated from it, and we can't fully understand it no matter how much we see. Let's have a look at this reference in the fourth line to ordinary pain. What I think Duffy is doing is acknowledging that yes, we all suffer, but the pain of people in England and places without war are rather normal. Yeah, and it kind of is done in contrast to the extraordinary suffering faced in war. Of course, suffering is part of humanity and life, but it's not supposed to be war. And then we get to the last image of this stanza, fields which explode, running children. So this deeply disturbing graphic imagery, and it brings to our mind the Nick Ut photo, which I showed you at the beginning, of the napalm victims terrified fleeing from the napalm bomb in the Vietnam War. And this imagery reminds us of that photo and the suffering, and it's again putting into the reader's mind the purpose of a war photographer's job, to stop this kind of suffering. Go to the third stanza. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So here what's going on literally is that the thing that's happening is a photo is developing. It starts as a white paper, and the photo gradually forms sort of in a ghost-like way. Okay, and it's a photo of a dying man. And the fictional photographer is remembering how he looked to the wife of the man to say, is it okay to take the photo? Let's have a look. Now he's describing what's coming out of the photo, what's developing, and it's a stranger's features which twist. This verb twist is a verb of contortion. It's very painful, as if the face of this person is twisted in pain and agony. Literally what's happening with the twisting is that the chemicals are reacting and the photos are appearing in twisted parts. But obviously metaphorically, it's the pain, the twisted features of this dying man in the photo. We're told that there's a half-formed ghost. Literally it's the faded photo where it hasn't fully come out of the white paper, the chemicals are bringing it out. But metaphorically it represents the man as being half dead, because he's not fully dead, he's dying, and he seems to be mutilated. the use of the word half, suggesting bits of him are perhaps no longer there. Let's go now to the third line. He remembers the cries of this man's wife. Now this is deeply disturbing. We see that from seeing the photo, the fictional photographer is thrown back in time to remembering this woman crying. This verb cry shows the deep distress and the grief of this woman, knowing that her husband is dying. And the victim here, the man's wife, is being personalised, with the attachment to the man and to the wife, suggesting that this dying man was loved. He's not just a picture, he's a person, and people love him and they will suffer for his death. Let's move towards the end. The photographer sought approval, without words, to do what someone must. And here the reader, us, we can really picture the exchange of looks between the photographer and the wife, and her look of acceptance, saying, yes, okay, I allow you to take the photo. Let's look at this verb must. It's a modal verb of obligation. And it's mirroring the view that Duffy holds, that this painful job needs to be done, must be done, even though it is painful for both the photographer and the people being photographed. Now the last two words of this really pulled me in. Duffy says it's foreign dust where the blood is staining. Now why does he just not say dust of the ground? For me, this is emphasising, through the use of the word foreign, the distance between us in England and the people in the war zone. And it's really showing our difficulty to truly empathise. It feels foreign, alien, away from us. And so we can't fully grasp their suffering, no matter how many photos we see. Let's move to the end. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not. So here we're learning a lot of things. Let's break it down. We hear that in the photos there are 100 agonies, and the editor's going to pick 5 or 6. And this produces a real contrast of numbers. We've got hundreds of photos suggesting hundreds, thousands of people are suffering. And it's contrasted with the 5 or 6 that we'll actually see, showing that really all we know about war is the tip of the iceberg. We don't see really how much suffering is going on. Now these agonies, these photos, are in black and white. So that's literally the colour of the photos in the newspaper. But it's a metaphorical meaning. When we say something is black and white, it means it's clear-cut or easy to understand. Now what Duffy seems to be doing is mocking the idea that war and its solutions are ever clear. She's suggesting that war is not black and white, it's not clear, and it's not easy to fix. Now let's look where these photos end up. They end up in the Sunday supplement. That's the sort of the magazine that comes in the Sunday newspaper. And it seems to me that Duffy is suggesting that coverage of war is sidelined by the media, meaning that it's not prominent, it's not in the main newspaper, it's something hidden, and therefore the media's not giving it the coverage and the amount of time and the prestige that it deserves. Let's have a look now. We see that the reader, on seeing the photos of a dying man, have tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. This is really quite disturbing to me. The tears mirror the momentary sadness that we feel when we see these sorts of photos, but it shows how it's soon forgotten by the enjoyment of our lives. Yes, we have a few tears, but we had it, first of all, the relaxing bath, and then the enjoyable lunchtime beers, or the pre-lunch beers, then the nice lunch. And there's a contrast between how we enjoy our lives, and they obviously cannot, these people in war zones, and how it's contrasting our short-lived moment of sadness with the amount of joy that we have in our lives, perhaps suggesting that we need to pay more attention to war zones and actually do something and be less selfish. Within the last 2 lines of this poem gets the photographer flying up into the air, and he's looking downwards, and he stares impassively. And he's looking impassively at the people of England below him and the country. Impassively is an adverb, and we're showing the lack of emotion and detachment which the photographer is feeling. And this is emphasising his disillusionment with those at home, and it's creating a metaphorical distance between him and everyone back home. We see that his work has numbed him. Okay, last thing, if you're going for the really high grades, you need to make a comment about structure and form somewhere in your comparative essays. Now, this poem uses a lot of enjambment, where the lines flow from one to another. And I think this shows the photographer's inability to separate his work from his life. And it's also emphasising how all human lives are really intertwined. Our behaviours affect other people's lives, and our lack of action is intertwined with allowing wars to happen. If we look at the poems, they are regular 6-line stanzas. They've got quite similar line lengths all along, and this feels to me like a physical representation of how the war photographer is kind of trying to bring an order to chaos and devastation. This poem is very ordered and regular, and he's trying through his photography to bring a sense of order to war, to try and stop war. The poem feels rather predictable in the similarity of the stanza lengths and lines, and perhaps this predictability is a metaphor for the depressing predictability of war and the indifference of people like us at home. Okay, I hope this has really helped you to understand the poem and will help you in your exam. Good luck.